Hello, my name is Jean-Jacques Nantel. A lot of people seem to believe that humans could destroy millions and millions of living species without ever suffering from it. It's false. Only to stay alive, we need the forests, the oceans, and the land, which produce the air, the water, and the food we consume. During the last 4 billion years, it's life that made this planet habitable. Without it, Earth would look like the dead surface of the moon. Yes, it's true, for 3 billion years there were only bacteria on this planet. However, it is certain that humans could not survive in a world populated only by bacteria, since our modern industrial poisons kill everything alive, including bacteria. Our species pollutes so much that according to the World Meteorological Organization, there were 5 times more storms and floods in 2010 than in 1970, which shows that we are not only disrupting the climate, but also the earth-water cycle. The water cycle is what slowly eliminated the poisons which covered the planet in the past by carrying them to the lakes and to the oceans, where they were buried under very thick layers of sediments. Unfortunately, during the last 250 years, our industries brought those poisons back to the surface, on top of releasing in the environment enormous quantities of artificial toxic chemicals. To make matters worse, many of our modern sewer systems use the water cycle to transport all sorts of garbage to the oceans, which accelerate their environmental decline. The newly industrialized countries are the main culprits here, since 2/3 of the plastic garbage found in the oceans these days come from about 10 emergent countries. This is alarming for many reasons. First, because the oceans cover 71% of the surface of the globe and are the most vital parts of our global ecosystem. Second, because most emergent countries prioritize their economic development over environmental protection. And third, because nobody on this planet really controls what's going on. Our political leaders, in particular, are totally overwhelmed by the variety, the scale, and the speed of modern-day events. Sometimes they don't even understand them. They are so incompetent that they keep talking about economic growth on a planet which is dying because of our industrial pollution. They did not even notice the most important phenomenon of our time, namely the extremely rapid fertility decline in the developing world. In other words, the rest of mankind understood that our endless growth had to stop, and they are doing everything they can to make sure that things like our national debts or the stock exchange indexes keep growing. Since the subprime crisis of 2008, they made things worse by letting the interest rate go down to 0%, a move that allows totally unproductive speculators to make fortunes by investing the billions of dollars they borrowed for almost nothing from those who produce something useful. It is systematic. When our political leaders discover that something really big is happening in their homeland, they start talking as if it was the result of one of their decisions. For instance, the Chinese Communist Party recently declared that it had decided to build a megalopolis of 150 million people around Beijing and 2 other cities of 80 million people around Shanghai and Canton, when in fact those megacities would have appeared anyway due to the unstoppable urbanization of hundreds of millions of Chinese peasants. It is always easy to predict the future when such a massive and powerful phenomenon is at play. That remark is almost always true. If we know with an extreme precision the exact moment when the sun will rise on the 1st of January 2050, it is because enormous moving objects are involved. For the same reason, it is very easy to predict that a runaway train that is going downhill at full speed will derail at the first curve it will encounter, etc. Nowadays, the collapse of the world environment is so rapid and obvious that we can make certain reliable demographic predictions for the future, at least for the whole planet. What history teaches us is that when the natural environments of a society have been weakened and can no longer produce the food and the water needed by its citizens, its population starts declining. For instance, historians believe that the collapse of the Maya civilization was provoked by the deterioration of its agricultural land. They believe the same thing happened to the Cambodian civilization of Angkor Wat and to the tribal society living on Easter Island. What is important to remember here is that such demographic collapses are totally unintentional and are the inevitable result of an environmental degradation. As we showed in the last video of this series, mankind as a whole will have to pass through a demographic bottleneck like that during the coming centuries. There is no way out. Our global population will have to diminish until it reaches an environmentally sustainable level. Because life will be more and more difficult, families will make less and less and less babies, especially in the most overcrowded and polluted countries. It is already happening in China. Second, the billions of old people our bankrupt governments will no longer be able to support will be so weak and malnourished that they will die at an ever younger age due to simple diseases like the flu. One by one, elderly people will start dying without making any fuss in their beds or in hospitals. Such a reduction in life expectancy often happened in the past, even in countries where there were no famines. It happened in Russia after the end of communism, as you can see on this graph. Discouragement, alcoholism, and neglect were the culprits here. It took Russia one generation to recover. If things like that happen, it is because when there is a severe crisis, those who can and do work are forced to feed themselves and their children before anybody else. Since the economic depression I'm talking about will affect the whole world, mass migration, at least in the faraway countries, will no longer be a practical solution for three main reasons. First, because there will be no more available jobs in the developed countries, even for the local population. Second, because the immigrants who will live there will also struggle to feed themselves and will not have enough money to finance the immigration of their relatives. And third, because social services all over the world will then be overwhelmed by the sheer number of needy, hungry, and homeless people. This is what happened during the Depression of the 1930s when immigration in North America almost stopped. The fact of the matter is that immigration has never been an efficient way to cope with overpopulation. If, during the last 5 centuries, an overcrowded Europe has been devastated by so many wars, despite the fact that its population surpluses could have moved to North America, it is because North Americans needed a lot of time to build the houses, the factories, the cities, and everything necessary to receive and feed millions and millions of newcomers. When, in a country, the working age population can no longer find work, emigrate, or feed itself, it becomes more and more aggressive, and the number of manifestations, of revolts, and of robberies keeps increasing. Since the environmental situation will only worsen in the coming decades, the most disorganized countries of the world will be ravaged by revolutions and civil wars. A bankrupt country like Venezuela, where unemployment and inflation are already out of control, shows how quickly a country can go from riches to rags and from a stable situation to anarchy. In certain regions of the world, it's even worse. It is the case of the Great Lake regions in Central Africa, where immense territories are no longer under the control of central governments and where rapes, murders, ethnic cleansing, and even genocides have become common practices. Those forgotten wars have already killed millions of people. In order to avoid being massacred by angry crowds, the leaders of a country in crisis often try to solve the problem by launching an external war where most of the unemployed young men they fear will be killed. Normally, they don't have to look very far to find enemies, since most nations have been quarreling for centuries with their most immediate neighbors. The French and the Germans fought for millennia. Arabs don't like Iranians. Argentinians and Chileans don't like each other. And the Chinese, who remember very well the massacres of the Second World War, would like to settle the score with the Japanese. The only characteristic that is common to all wars, I'm talking about real wars here, is that they kill, maim, or disfigure a lot of young men who will never be fathers. In other words, if in the future the worldwide fertility decline will reduce the number of babies and malnutrition the number of old people, wars will be used to eliminate an ever-growing number of young and healthy unemployed people. As you can verify with the bibliography I will put at the end of the video, modern wars are becoming very efficient at killing people, since UNICEF recently reported that 90% of those killed in modern wars were civilians. It's not a big surprise, since it's much easier and safe to kill unarmed civilians than trained soldiers who stand behind machine guns. Urban warfare are especially deadly for soldiers as well as for civilians for many reasons. First, because a lot of people live in cities. Second, because it's very easy to ambush people in an environment full of walls, rubble, and hidden tunnels. Third, because those who build cities use as much geometry as possible to make them as efficient as possible, which only increase the killing ratio in an urban war. Stadiums are probably the best example of that, since they have been designed and built so that every single spectator can see whatever happens on the field. When you look at the crowd in a stadium, you see only heads, which are the most vital part of their bodies. It means that if a powerful bomb was detonated in the middle of a stadium, almost everybody would be killed at once. Something similar happened, but at a much larger scale, in the Nagasaki of 1945, which had been built in a valley, and where the vast majority of its population has been killed instantly by the second atomic bomb dropped on Japan. In certain countries, even a single conventional bomb detonated at a strategic location could kill a large percentage of the population. Egypt is probably the best example of that, since the vast majority of its 95 million inhabitants live in the Nile Valley, a valley which is flanked on its two sides by hills and mountains. The problem here is that the Egyptian government has built a dam in Upper Egypt in the 1960s, a dam which retains the billions of cubic meters of water of Lake Nasser. If a bomb was to explode underwater at the base of that that dam would crack, break, and release a gigantic tsunami that would rush at full speed through the valley of the Nile like a bullet through the barrel of a gun and kill tens of millions of Egyptians. Up until the beginning of the 20th century, the armies were fighting with relatively weak weapons, and soldiers normally ended up killing each other with swords, spears, or bayonets. War was then a two-dimensional affair. An attacking army always tried to fight on a very flat terrain, while the retreating army, which was weaker, hid its soldiers behind forests, rocks, or hills. Its strategy was then to lure the attacking army as far away as possible from its bases in order to weaken it with multiple and constant skirmishes and ambushes. In a word, the defending army tried to absorb the energy of the attacker by using matter, space, and time. Those two-dimensional wars disappeared with the military revolution of the 20th century, when armies started using the third dimensions with airships, airplanes, submarines, and nowadays drones, intercontinental missiles, and satellites. Since those weapons can destroy faraway targets with great accuracy, modern armies avoid to concentrate them like their predecessors did with their artillery. To keep them safe, they rather disperse their aircraft carriers, for example, on a very large area and launch convergent attacks on the main command centers of the enemy, which are normally located in its capital city. The world's natural resources are so depleted these days that most modern wars are fought to control some strategic raw materials like petroleum. Without petroleum, our cities and our highways would not be lit at night. Without petroleum, the Middle East wouldn't be the mess it is, and the superpowers wouldn't fight so hard to control the flow of petroleum, which feeds the world economy. Since the United States are by far the most important maritime superpower, they do control the vast majority of the maritime choke point where supertankers are forced to pass, which explains why continental powers like Russia or China are presently building a vast network of land pipelines all over Eurasia. And it is to impede such land pipelines to pass through a central region like the Middle East that the U.S. military establishments are financing many wars around the Saudi Arabian oil fields. Modern warfare has also been revolutionized by the development of weapons of mass destruction like the atomic bomb or the bacteriological bombs. Those weapons have become so powerful that since 1945 nobody dared using them. They have become purely defensive weapons. Nowadays, even a small nation can protect its territory and its independence by arming a handful of nuclear submarines who can hide anywhere and, if necessary, for months among the countless mountains that are found at the bottom of the world's seas and oceans. Of course, such a situation cannot last for a millennium or even a century, since the risk of an accident increases with the number of atomic bombs in service. Add to that the fact that human beings who did not evolve at all during the last 10,000 years can react in a very unpredictable manner when their lives are threatened. For instance, how would react a small nuclear power like Israel, whose population is obsessed with the Nazi massacres, if its army was to lose a conventional war? And what would do the dictator of a country like North Korea if somebody was stupid enough to corner him in his last bunker? I remind you that Adolf Hitler, in his last moments on this planet, ordered the destruction of the German infrastructure in an attempt to bring Germany with him in his grave. Finally, there are the terrorists whose dream is to detonate an atomic bomb over capital cities like Washington, Moscow, or Beijing. We're talking here about a 9/11 multiplied by 1,000. Remember what we said earlier about Beijing and its future population of 150 million people. Somebody once said, "I don't fear the man who has 100 atomic bombs at his disposal, but a lot the man who has only one." Considering the courage and the determination of modern-day terrorists who don't hesitate to blow themselves up to kill a handful of enemies, it is certain that someday they will put their hands on an atomic bomb and will use it against a large city like New York or Shanghai. Such an attack is unavoidable since it is impossible to inspect the millions of cars and trucks that pass through those cities each day, the thousands of airplanes flying over them, and the enormous quantity of containers that come from abroad and reach their harbor each day. The present situation is made all the more dangerous by the fact that in the century where a growing number of countries own weapons of mass destruction, mankind multiplies the number of perfect targets for such weapons by concentrating billions of people in a handful of megalopolises that sometimes contain more than 20 million inhabitants. Worse, most of our modern cities have been built near strategic locations, on a river that irrigates a coastal plain like New York, on a strait like Istanbul, where two rivers meet like Pittsburgh, where a large river narrows like in Quebec City, or at a crossroads and surrounded by a lot of agricultural land like Montreal. Those strategic cities all occupy the center of large communication networks made of seaways, harbors, canals, bridges, railways, highways, internet cables, etc. Our ancestors used to say all roads lead to Rome, and it remains true for our modern cities. The large communication networks I just talked about are often so important for a region that if a city like New York was destroyed or irradiated, it would become much more difficult, costly, and dangerous to go from Boston to Philadelphia, for example. In the case of New York, where Wall Street is located, the whole world would be affected. Our modern cities are also where we find the majority of our head offices, our universities, our research centers, our best hospitals, as well as most of our thinkers, our deciders, our artists, etc. The brutal loss of all those physical and human assets would have a tremendous long-term economic impact. In the cases of Paris and Moscow, it would be even worse, since those cities are also the seats of national governments. It's not all. A lot of industrial chemicals are also stockpiled in cities. Even if a small atomic bomb was to be detonated near them, it would create a very large cloud of toxic smoke that, along with the radioactive fallout coming from the bomb, would poison a very large territory. Since no head of state would be suicidal enough to launch an all-out nuclear war after an atomic terrorist attack, it is probable that the leaders of the country under attack would respond by destroying one or two cities located in countries without weapons of mass destruction, on top of assassinating all the non-terrorists as well as those who recruit, motivate and train them. However, That small revenge wouldn't change the fact that the country would have lost its most important city, and the war, which would encourage all the nobodies of the world to launch an even more devastating attack. To wage war with an atomic weapon is to wage war to the environment. Imagine the region of Verdun in France, which has been thoroughly bombed and gassed during the First World War, never recovered. 1 century later, its agricultural land and its groundwater are still heavily poisoned and totally unusable. And that was achieved without using radioactive materials that would last tens of thousands of years. Since almost all the world ecosystems are declining fast, it's clear that the planet will be unable to support even a very limited nuclear war. As a result, during the coming economic depression, mankind will be unable to do what it did in 1939 and get out of it by launching a third world war. Most probably, we will do what we have been doing for thousands of years. We will kill each other in regional wars. This being said, those wars will kill much less people than their consequences. We will talk about it in the next video. Did you enjoy the present video? Yes? Then recommend it to your friends and family, and read my book, which tackles those problems with much greater details. See you next time.